Debbie. I'd like to welcome Debbie Rupchan, who's the immediate past Assistant District Governor from Trinidad and Tobago. And she's the Peace Committee Chair for that district and 70-30. And she was the host of the United Nations International Day of Peace in Trinidad 3 years ago, to which I was invited as an international guest. And I had a wonderful time over there, and we did many wonderful things. And she also caused the planting of a Rotary peace pole outside City Hall in San Fernando, which was a wonderful evening on our candlelight walk around San Fernando. We'll never forget it. I got to direct traffic as a policeman in San Fernando and create quite a stir. So we had a great time all round. And, great to see Debbie here today.
Thanks for that, Jeff.
Without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to our President-elect, David Hirsch, who will now take over the program. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you for that, Jeff, and welcome everyone to this special meeting of the Rotary Club of Sydney, Tuesday Talks Lunch Meetings, celebrating the United Nations International Day of Peace. As Jeff mentioned, I'm the incoming president-elect for the Rotary Club of Sydney. I'm also the chair of our peace building group. I'd like to welcome our guest speakers, Mike Smith, Dr. Hugh McDermott, and a whole cast of others that you'll be seeing and hearing from in a few minutes. But for now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jem Romold, who is the Australian Director of ICANN. Jem, what are your thoughts on nuclear submarines, the treaty, and ICANN?
Hello, David and everyone. Wonderful to be here with you, and happy International Day of Peace. I wish we were celebrating in more peaceful times, but alas. So just briefly, I think I have about one and a half minutes. So to introduce the treaty for those who don't know, it's the first treaty that comprehensively outlaws nuclear weapons. And it was negotiated at the UN in 2017 and it entered into force in January this year. So we now have international law that clearly outlaws nuclear weapons, everything to do with them and assisting with them in any way. The treaty currently has 86 signatories and 55 states parties and is only growing in strength, and the norms that it sets out are only becoming more prominent. Of course, there is a long way to go. The first meeting of states parties to the treaty will be in March next year, and Australia hasn't signed up to this treaty yet. We think they should, and they should at least be engaging with it and attending that meeting in Vienna next March. As for the deal, I mean, there are many reasons to query this nuclear-powered submarine deal. We're currently seeking advice from experts and believe that the deal could undermine and certainly runs contrary to the spirit of treaties that we are a part of, including the Rarotonga Treaty, which sets up the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as well. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons itself doesn't specifically outlaw nuclear-powered submarines as long as they are never nuclear weapons capable. Australia would have to also ensure that we do not assist with US nuclear warfighting capabilities in any way, and we are concerned that there could be a grey area here. We are pleased, however, that all parties to this deal have been quite clear that the submarines will not be nuclear armed, and that the Prime Minister is not currently seeking a domestic nuclear arsenal, although we know that there are some voices calling for that, which we obviously loudly resist. So we seek more than just assurances that at press conferences that there will not be any pursuit of nuclear weapons, and we actually want a guarantee that Australia will not host the nuclear weapons of another country. So we want to know that Australia wouldn't be taking on UK or US nuclear weapons or to seek to develop its own nuclear weapons. And we believe the best way to do that is to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Thanks for that, Jem, and we'll have a further talk about that later in the year. And some of you might be asking yourselves, well, that's all terribly interesting, but what does it have to do with Rotary? And to know the answer to that question, can I introduce District Governor Jeremy Wright. Jeremy, over to you.
David, thank you. And I'm always very pleased, delighted to attend Sydney Club meetings. And congratulations today for this event and all your wonderful guests and having Major General Mike Smith, AO, to speak to you. I believe there will be a reference to Afghanistan, and a brief reflection is that Rotary apparently has an ongoing dialogue with the Taliban to facilitate the ongoing polio vaccination program. So I think we can assume that apparently we all still love our children. I naturally applaud Gem Rumold and their Nobel Peace Prize for the International Coalition for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. As David said, the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is actually coming up as a resolution that Rotary could support. And it does complement our commitment to peace as a strong area of focus. So I, for one, think it makes very good sense. Very interestingly, our international president, Sheikha Mehta, also appears to be a strong advocate, because he's speaking at an international conference of physicians at the end of September before the vote for the resolution through Rotary. So there is some unity in spirit afoot to support the treaty from the point of view of Rotary, which I think is good news. I hope we all welcome that.
Thank you,
David. That's all I need to say. Back to you, and I look forward to hearing Mike's presentation. Thank you.
And you will soon. Thank you so much for that, Jeremy. Now, as the Secretary General said, COVID has turned our world upside down. Now, some of us have been more severely affected than others, and Western Sydney has been particularly hard hit by the effects of COVID-19. Dr. Hugh McDermott is a member of the Rotary Club of Sydney. He's also a member of the Legislative Assembly of New South Wales for the seat of Prospect in Western Sydney, and he will say a few words about his constituents, their challenges, and what is being done about it. Over to you, Hugh.
Thank you, David. And I appreciate you giving me this opportunity just to talk a bit about our area, Western Sydney. And I think it's very, very fitting that we talk about my community today, at International Day of Peace, because I'm just going to give you a quick reflection of my community. Now, my community, and probably any other electorate in the state, if not the country, is extremely multicultural, but also it is made up of people predominantly who have fled conflict, fled genocide, who have fled persecution. And let me just go through a quick rundown of who I'm talking that live all around me in my area, Western Sydney. In the north, we have a lot of South Sudanese and a community who either fled during the formation of the South Sudan, in the war between Sudan and South Sudan, or in the civil war that followed. We also have a significant Tamil community from Sri Lanka who fled during the civil war and the genocide that was committed towards them. I have a large Palestinian community, predominantly Christian, not Muslim, Christian, and there are also a significant amount of Jordanians who also fled to this country. We have a large Coptic Catholic community from Egypt, and I have a very large Armenian, Assyrian and Chaldean community from northern Iraq. Over 9,000 who fled from ISIS in the last 2 to 3 years and have come to this area of Western Sydney, but also going back even further under Saddam Hussein. I also have a significant amount of people from Jordan and Lebanon, Maronite as well, who've, especially in the last year or two, gone through a lot, but always going back even to the Civil War. So as you can see, it's a real snapshot of the world in one small area in Western Sydney. Further north, obviously, we have a significant Afghan community, which is a little outside of my electorate in Blacktown, but also many other communities from Vietnamese, Laotians and others, which have all seen conflict. So we have been in lockdown since June in the South electorate. We started with the Fairfield LGA, we moved into Cumberland and then to Blacktown LGA. They are all in the electorate of Prospect. So it has been a significant impact on these communities and our Australian community all throughout these last few months. There's been so many challenges. Economically, we've seen a significant loss of employment, so a large increased unemployment, closure of many small businesses, and also a major restriction on large businesses and whether they can employ people or basically even exist on the current lockdowns. The education system has been significantly impacted on, especially with refugee children. Many of those communities have had children who, especially the most recent 9,000 who've come in from northern Iraq, have been in refugee camps for many years. So they're literally, their kids are starting school at an older age, and they've now all lost schools. Their schooling, most don't have laptops, most don't have connectivity at home, and it's a big challenge for them. We also have a situation that vulnerable children, we have a very high rate of autism in Western Sydney. And so having this disruption really impacts on those families. And we look at the families, the increase in mental health issues and problems, mortgage rent and rent stress, which is impacting on people, and of course the rise in domestic violence. So, you know, it hasn't been an easy few months. But, you know, there are positives. You know, we've seen this community really pull together, really show, you know, what I guess the UN was set up for, and that was to help each other as one big community. You know, there's been a very strong sense of community between all these different groups because they have a lot in common. We've seen a high vaccination rate. We're certainly looking at 80 to 90% vaccination rates in these communities, which is quite amazing if you think about it. I think that at the moment, Blacktown will be hit around 95% of vaccination rates. It's incredible by October. And we've seen yesterday the State Treasury announced that $5 billion will be used in Western Sydney as a stimulus package for employment and infrastructure. So it's been a big challenge for our communities. In this day of peace, and this is why they are here, they've fled to this country to rebuild their lives, to be able to practice their faith, to be able to live without an issue. And this is what we're facing together at the moment, but at least we can see a road path out. But thank you, David. That just gives you a snapshot of what we're going through and continue to go through each day.
Thank you for that, Hugh. Thanks for that snapshot. It is time to introduce our principal guest speaker for today, retired Major General Mike Smith. Mike has been in the Australian Defence Force for 34 years. He served in Cambodia, Kashmir, Libya, Myanmar, Nepal, Timor-Leste, and Yemen. He's the former CEO of AustCare, which is now Action Aid Australia. He's a non-executive director for the Institute for Economics and Peace, who you probably should know is in partnership with Rotary to promote understandings of the principles of positive peace. Mike has a special interest in peace and security. He's also a Rotarian. It's been 20 years since 9/11, the start of the War on Terror, and that 20th anniversary coincided with the retaking of Kabul in Afghanistan by the Taliban. Are there lessons to be learned from all this? I suspect they are. Are we going to learn them? That's another matter. To offer his reflections on the War on Terror and lessons for peace building, with special emphasis on Australia's role in the war in Afghanistan, I'd like to introduce Mike Smith. Now, can I just say that because of time, we're not going to have questions and answers. So, Mike, you have the floor for the next 20 minutes or so. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, can you hear me?
We see you, we see you, we hear you, and you're extremely well dressed.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, let me also add my congratulations to Armour and Turbans for Australia. Obviously, a great group of Sadajis there doing terrific work. Well, greetings from the National Capital in Canberra, home of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I also acknowledge all of our First Nation people throughout Australia. I'd like to thank Sydney Rotary for the opportunity to speak today on this, the International Day of Peace, and I commend the UN Secretary-General's message to us all. As a former Rotarian, I am very conscious of the exceptional contribution that Rotary makes to local communities globally and the critical importance of Rotary's work in understanding and promoting peace. Given the current state of world affairs and in the midst of this terrible pandemic, Rotary's work is more important than ever. I'd like to acknowledge the many Australians, military and civilian, who faithfully served our country overseas in the War on Terror, and particularly those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. they did what their country asked of them. My condolences to their families and loved ones. Some Australians, of course, are still serving overseas in countries impacted by the war on terror. Others have been incapacitated, and sadly a large and disturbing number have committed or contemplated suicide as a result of their experiences. However, this number is minimal and pales into insignificance when compared with casualties of nationals from the countries most affected by the war on terror. I'm also aware that some of my old friends are in attendance today, and I sincerely hope that we will still be friends after you hear what I have to say. The war on terror in Afghanistan is a large and very complex issue. As we all know, Al-Qaeda's devastating terrorist attack on New York and Washington on the 9th of September 2001, 9/11, heralded in the war on terror in retaliation, which directly led to regime changes in Afghanistan and Iraq through military action. These momentous events largely shaped international relations and global priorities for the first 2 decades of the 21st century. The war on terror also enabled actions to be taken by some countries in the name of national security. Some of these actions contravened human rights and international humanitarian laws, as well as restricting freedom of action and movement of citizens, challenging privacy and identity, and eroding civil liberties. Some examples include, but are not limited to, the illegal invasion of Iraq, rendition and indeterminate detention of suspects without trial, torture, otherwise known as enhanced interrogation techniques, drone attacks causing significant collateral damage, possible war crimes, particularly by special forces, and significant levels of malfeasance and corruption in the provision of military and civilian aid. Collectively, I believe these actions have weakened the West's moral standing throughout the world and have helped promote successive generations of terrorists. The final impacts of the war on terror remain unclear. What I do know is that after 20 years of prosecuting the war on terror in Afghanistan, the Taliban has been replaced by the Taliban. This raises the dual questions of whether it has all been worth it and whether the world is a safer place because of the war on terror. Following a presentation I gave in Brisbane in 2003, I was asked if I agreed with the war on terror. I said I did not, because you should never start an unwinnable war against a tactic. Because it only provides succour and stimulus to such causes. Instead, strong counter-terrorism measures should be adopted and an attempt made to understand the root causes of the grievances. I do not condone terrorism, but invariably poverty and disrespect are major contributors. The Australian Prime Minister, John Howard, who was obviously influenced from witnessing the horrors of 9/11 when visiting the US, quickly invoked the ANZUS Treaty in justification of Australia's response. I think this was a grave error of judgment, made without consultation with the Australian people, similar to what has more recently transpired with the announcement of the AUKUS agreement. In the time available, I will very briefly cover 3 related issues, and I was hoping I'd get some questions, but obviously I won't now. So first, I'll give some reflections on the war on terror. Second, I'll suggest some lessons from the largely failed and expensive attempts to build peace in Afghanistan. And third, I'll highlight what I believe are some key strategic priorities for Australia. I should make 2 disclaimers. Firstly, I am not a counter-terrorism expert. And second, I have never served in Afghanistan or Iraq in a military or a civilian capacity. Although I did serve as a senior civilian for the United Nations in Libya for a year and subsequently briefly in Yemen, both countries, of course, impacted and influenced by the war on terror. In 2013, I wrote a fairly lengthy chapter for a book on Afghanistan where I assessed Australia's civil military lessons from Afghanistan. I concluded that our involvement in Afghanistan was flawed and should not be used as a model for the future. I have shared a copy of my chapter with John, should you wish to read it. So let me start with some reflections on the war on terror. And let me start with the costs. According to the Watson Institute Costs of War project at Brown University in the US, which is the best source I found for this, no compelling alternatives to the war on terror were seriously considered in the aftermath of 9/11. It was all about retribution, revenge, and regime change against evil forces that threatened freedom. These imperatives provided negligible opportunity for peace and reconciliation. According to the Costs of War project, the war on terror has cost more than $8 trillion US, and it has led to the loss of up to 929,000 lives. Of those killed, at least 801,000 people died from direct war violence, including armed forces from all sides, contractors, civilians, journalists, and humanitarian workers. As well, an estimated 38 million people were displaced by the post-9/11 conflicts in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and the Philippines. The study indicates that human and economic costs, as well, I would argue, as ecological degradation from the war on terror, will continue for decades, including for America, the financial cost of caring for their veterans. I don't have the costs for Australia, and if anyone does, I'd welcome them to please share them with me. What about defeating terrorism? Is the world safer from terrorists as a result of the war on terror? It is hard to know for sure, but probably not. The annual Global Terrorism Index, or GTI, produced by the Institute for Economics and Peace, on which I am a non-executive director, indicates that acts of terrorism peaked in 2014, well after the commencement of the war on terror, and coincidentally after President Obama stopped using that slogan. According to the GTI, terrorism also comes with a heavy financial cost. The global economic impact of terrorism was conservatively estimated at $26.4 billion US in 2019, which was 25% lower than the year previously in 2018. It is true that Al-Qaeda has not been successful in further attacks on the US, at least that I'm aware of. But this is probably due to more stringent counter-terrorist practices at home rather than the prime focus, which was the war on terror. Far from defeating Al-Qaeda, the war on terror gave its substance and it spawned a growing number of militant jihadist terrorist groups, including ISIS. The war on terror probably also contributed to the rise of extreme right-wing and non-Muslim movements conducting and condoning terrorist acts. It is also doubtful that the war on terror made Australia safer, and perhaps the reverse. I recall that in the early days of the war on terror, the Australian Federal Police Commissioner, Mick Keelty, was asked this question and responded, I thought honestly, that he thought Australia's participation could increase the likelihood of attacks against Australians. He was strongly rebuked by Prime Minister Howard and the then CDF General Peter Cosgrove. However, the subsequent terrorist attacks against Australians in Jakarta and Bali would seem to give substance to Keelty's opinion. What about the return of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan? We don't yet know if this will increase acts of terrorism by jihadists in Afghanistan and other countries, including in Australia and our immediate region, which is home to the largest Muslim population on the planet, Indonesia. but it is hard to see how the Taliban's victory would necessarily decrease the likelihood of Afghanistan again becoming a haven and training ground for jihadists. Perhaps the best outcome would be if the Taliban perceived local competitors such as ISIS-K as the most immediate threat and took positive action with the international community to contain them. Much will depend on how countries such as the US, and to a lesser extent Australia, are prepared to deal with the interim Afghan government, and whether or not the US will seek to cause instability through continued civil war, much as they did with the Mujahideen before 9/11. What impact did the war on terror have on the global balance of power? There can be little doubt that the war on terror contributed to undermining the rules-based international order, which had largely been established following World War II to preserve peace. While the shift in the global balance of power between the US and China was certainly not caused by the war on terror, it significantly diverted US attention and resources and benefited China's rise, not least because the behaviour of the US and its allies was not appreciated in many countries, and particularly Muslims who felt vilified. In the Middle East, the war on terror certainly shifted the regional balance of power in favour of Iran. Bogged down in Afghanistan and the Middle East, the US pivot to the Indo-Pacific never really materialised, despite the rhetoric to do so. In some respects, the untidy, but I believe inevitable, withdrawal from Afghanistan is an attempt by President Biden to refocus attention from terrorism to state-centric threats, with priority given to competition with China, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. This is clear from the President's interim National Security Strategic Guidance of March 2001, where China is identified as the primary threat. Turning to my second point, what are some of the lessons from attempts to build peace in Afghanistan? Apart from the many UN resolutions that have repeatedly mandated for the protection of civilians in Afghanistan, the best account I have read comes from the US Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, known as SIGAR. A similar inspectorate was established to examine Iraq reconstruction, and it was called SIGAR, the deputy of which I had the pleasure of dealing with when I was leading the Australian Civil Military Centre. One of the true strengths of the US government is its appointment of such authorities. They leave no stone unturned, sort of like the Australian National Audit Office on steroids. I highly recommend both SIGAR's and SIGAR's reports for anyone interested in the reconstruction of Afghanistan and Iraq. The first lesson from Afghanistan identified in SIGAR's final report deals with strategy, or lack of it. The report concluded that, and I quote, "The US government continuously struggled to develop and implement a coherent strategy for what it hoped to achieve," unquote. I arrived at the same conclusion in my chapter of Australian Civil Military Lessons. In essence, the strategy waxed and waned between counter-terrorism to counterinsurgency to nation building. The truth is that one could not be achieved without the other. And I would be happy to elaborate on this, well, I would have been in question time, should anybody be interested, or contact me if you want more information on that. In Australia's case, I believe that the only permanent strategy was our support for the United States, which explains our decision to totally withdraw our military from Afghanistan to Iraq, only later to return them to Afghanistan as part of the surge. SIGAR also identified another 6 key lessons. These were the inability to establish a sustainable institutions and infrastructure in Iraq, which was accompanied by malfeasance and corruption on an epic scale. The failure to they had counterproductive civilian and military personnel policies. The persistence of insecurity thwarted progress. The failure to properly understand the historical, social, economic, cultural and political dynamics in Afghanistan, which I think was a huge failure, and the lack of effective and honest monitoring and evaluation of what they were doing there. In summary, and as was duplicated in Iraq, the US is very good at regime change and warfighting, but poor at nation building. So what are the prospects for peace in Afghanistan? As someone who has been involved in both conflict analysis and development for many years, both as a soldier and a civilian, I've come to the conclusion that peace cannot be imposed and sustained by outsiders. In all likelihood, and regrettably, Afghanistan will probably continue to be a country in conflict for the foreseeable future. Other than providing humanitarian assistance, which I certainly hope that Australia will do, our country would be wise to consider only providing assistance that is requested and owned by the Afghans. Our government will need to make decisions as to if and how it works with the Afghan government, and the extent to which we will support the UN Special Political Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, whose mandate has just been extended for 6 months, and which, to my knowledge, retains a sizable presence of around 1,200 personnel. UNAMA is probably the best hope for the international community to influence peace, but there are no silver bullets, and progress will almost certainly be slow. I also think there would be considerable merit in encouraging both the Afghan government and local Afghan communities to consider and workshop the 8 pillars of positive peace as detailed by the Institute for Economics and Peace. Now, you may well have other issues about Afghanistan that you might like to explore if we had had question time. Issues such as the criminal and drug trade, the role of warlords, the future of women and girls under the Taliban, assistance to and visas for Afghans who worked for Australia, and the roles and influence of other states, particularly regional neighbours. These are all big questions. Turning to my last point, what are some of the key strategic considerations for Australia? 3 major considerations spring to my mind, although you may well have others, and I'd be very eager to learn these. First and overall, Australia urgently needs a national security strategy. Given the frequency of national security policy announcements by our government, the latest being the AUKUS submarine deal, one would assume that we have a national security policy in place to guide such decisions by the National Security Committee of Cabinet. But we don't, and we have not had one since 2013. Nor did we have a national security strategy when 9/11 occurred. Perhaps if we did, then better decisions about the war on terror could have been assessed against that strategy. The need for a national security strategy is a subject that needs far more attention and involvement by civil society, and is beyond the time limits of this presentation. I would certainly encourage Rotary to get involved in that. Now, second, we will need to continue to have effective counter-terrorism policies and practices. The threat from terrorism has not dissipated, and to some extent, and has grown with the rise of extreme right-wing non-Islamic groups. We will need to continue to work collaboratively with other countries and multilateral bodies to counter such terrorist threats. In particular, we will need to work ever more closely with Indonesia and countries in our immediate region. And third, in relation to Afghanistan, I hope that Australia does not simply turn its back on the people of Afghanistan. We have been complicit in a major failure, and we should remain engaged to the extent we can. We remain responsible for those Afghans who supported our efforts. I hope that Australia considers establishing a physical diplomatic presence if possible. In the first instance, this probably does not to be an embassy. This would be the most effective way to continue our efforts to evacuate those Afghans that supported Australia during the past 20 years. And we should provide visas for those who have already been evacuated. I hope that we generously support the UN humanitarian efforts in Afghanistan and the efforts of UNAMA, and that we pursue opportunities to fill senior UN appointments. Well, thank you for your attention. In the time available, I've only glossed the surface, and I would have looked forward to your comments and questions. In concluding, and despite the current pessimistic state of world affairs, I remind you all of the UN Secretary General's message for the International Day of Peace. Quote, "Peace is not a naive dream. It's a light in the darkness," he said. And of course, achieving peace requires a lot of hard work, to which Rotary is already strongly committed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Mike. Time is always our enemy in these things. But I wonder if I could just take the liberty for a minute or two to ask a question that I imagine a lot of other people have been thinking about listening to your excellent presentation. The first thing that comes to mind is that expression, tell us what you really think. That was one of the most straight up, direct indictments of a failed policy that I've heard in a very long time. So thank you for your candor in that. But you said that you would welcome some thoughts on how we can learn to work together towards peace. And you referred to the principles of positive peace in the by the Institute for Economics and Peace. Can you just say a little word for how do you see the crossover between the principles of positive peace and what we can do to not make the same mistakes again in Afghanistan?
I think it has to be made available to the Afghan government, and more importantly, communities and provincial governments and all the rest of it. So the first thing that probably needs to be done, it needs to be translated into documents that can be easily read. The wonderful thing about positive peace is that it doesn't really have any political basis to it. And therefore, those 8 pillars that it identifies are 8 pillars that everybody can relate to. It doesn't matter whether you are at the community level running a community project or at the national level running the government. Those 8 pillars can resonate with you. And it's up to the Afghans to look at those if they're able to, and say which ones they want to give most emphasis to. And the good thing about IEP is it's not politically aligned. And so it just provides a vehicle. And as Rotary does as well. So it's a big ask. It may never happen. But if the Afghans don't know about it, it will never happen. So there's a ray of hope.
Thanks for that. This is a huge topic, and I really wish that we had another 3 hours to speak with you. Perhaps we can get you back again and we can drill into some of these matters a little bit more deeply. But in the time available to us, what I need to do now is introduce us all to Charlie Allen. Charlie is the Partnerships Director with the Institute for Economics and Peace. He's a member of the Rotary Club of Sydney Peace Building Group, Vice President of our club, a good friend. And can I ask Charlie to please give us a vote of thanks to Mike for his superb presentation?
Certainly can, and with pleasure. And just leading on from Mike's last comment, I strongly recommend a book written by Mark Isaacs, The Kabul Peace House, which is super interesting read, which is grassroots Afghan people in Kabul who are implementing those principles of positive peace. I'd like to start by, first of all, also congratulating Turbans for Australia for winning the Peace Award. Charanjit Satriakal, thank you for the work of Turbans for Australia, and thank you for your personal commitment. It's really appreciated. To Mike, thank you for your presentation today. I should say thank you to Electra Spathropoulos, who recommended you, Mike. Enjoyed your presentation. Your CV, or some of your CV, was read out at the start of the presentation, the extensive military experience, but I should have to mention your current role as the president of the Gallipoli Scholarship, and also your past roles with as president of United Nations Association of Australia and your lead in AusAid. I had the good pleasure to be on assignment with Mike whilst he was the president of UNAA, and we did a project together in a province in Thailand called Nakhon Nayok, where we did a 5-day workshop. I might be a little bit indulgent and quickly share a photo. A 5-day workshop in Nakhon Nayok. And the workshop was about building the leadership potential of young Thai, and many of these young Thai coming from provinces that were in conflict. The point of sharing this story and sharing this picture, and the thank you to Mike, is just driving home that Mike's leadership and knowledge doesn't come from a position of an armchair commentator. It comes from a position a person who has and continues to be a practitioner. So that's what I really like about Mike. His knowledge comes from that extensive practice. Thank you for your presentation today, Mike. And to thank you, we'll also be contributing $100 to the Rotary Give Every Child a Future project, which is immunising young people in the Pacific. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much indeed, Charlie. And I must